Okay, so before we actually get started into the lesson, I want to correct something, mistake that I made last week. Because, you know, I'm all about correcting mistakes. That was sarcasm. So last week, one of the questions, and I'll get with her afterwards since she's in class now. One of the questions that Peggy had asked, I thought it was someone on this side, and then I had to go back and watch the class, and okay, it's the voice, it was Peggy, okay. But she had asked, when we were talking about Abraham, as to why given the land of Canaan versus any other spot. And I had mentioned, you know, geography and climate, and while those things play a factor, there is something more. And I wanted to make sure to point that out, not just for those that are in the class, but those who may watch this online and are like, he's wrong, I'm not attending there. So I do want to point this out, and then we'll get into the class. But over in Genesis chapter 15, you know, the land of Canaan, it was filled with idol worshipers, right? And so over in Genesis 15, it says there, in verse 16, in the fourth generation, they, talking about the descendants of Abraham, will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Now, in the verses before this, he's saying, you know, this land that you see, your descendants, they're going to inherit it. But before they inherit it, they're going to be enslaved for 400 years. And then they're going to come in and take this land. And so part of it, part of the Egyptian enslavement under Pharaoh, them being enslaved for 400 years, was an opportunity for these people to reach full wickedness, and we say reach full wickedness because it says the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So God knew the direction that they were going to take. God knew, in His foreknowledge, knew that they were not going to repent. And that also kind of speaks to us in a way in that sometimes, now you think about that 400 years of slavery in Egyptian bondage. Now that's a few generations, because by that point, people are not living, you know, 600-700 years old anymore. But it speaks to us in that sometimes the trials that we go through are actually God, you know, is that God's refining us because something else is happening over here that we may not be aware of. Okay? And then when we get over to Deuteronomy chapter 9, it's a recollection of this promise. Deuteronomy chapter 9, verses 5 and 6 says that it's not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart that you go and possess their land, but because of the wickedness of these nations, that the Lord your God drives them out from before you, that He might fulfill the word which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Therefore, verse 6, understand that the Lord your God is not giving you this good land to possess because of your righteousness, for you are a stiff-necked people, or a stubborn people. And so when we look at this, we have this promise in Genesis chapter 12, this Abrahamic covenant. And we get to Genesis 15, and today we're going to look at kind of the in-between here. But we get to Genesis 15, and he's like, this land, your ancestors, or your descendants, they're going to possess, but the Amorites, they haven't reached their full wickedness yet. And so for 400 years, the Amorites are getting more wicked, more wicked, more wicked. And we get over here to Deuteronomy chapter 9, and Moses, he's writing, and he says, you need to understand that the reason you're getting this land isn't because of anything that you did. It's not because you're righteous. It's not because you deserve it. It's because God made a promise, and He is fulfilling that promise. That's why you're getting this land. And He even says there in verse 6, you're stubborn or stiff-necked. I I forgot my regular Bible, so I had to go with the King James here. But you're stubborn. You're a stiff-necked people. But God's not. God's not like us. God keeps His promises. Right? Make sense? Questions? Comments? Yes, ma'am.
I didn't remember that, when God sent the plagues on the Egyptians,
Mm-hmm.
some people believe that those plagues were directed at the Egyptian gods.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, there's each one of those, if you look at the plagues and you compare them to the Egyptian gods, each one of those plagues directly connects to a god that was, over the frogs or over the sun or over hail or what have you. A direct response to those.
And that's kind of
Well, idols. The Egyptians called them gods. Yeah. And, we have to remember, later in the book, and we will get to it, that the Hebrew people, many of them were also worshiping those false gods. And there's a whole interesting thing there, because just like when the Hebrew people, when the slaves leave Pharaoh, it's not just them that are leaving, but Egyptians leave with them. And so it's kind of interesting in that respect. But yeah, no, absolutely. And when we get there, we are actually going to talk about that some, because it does play into God's redemptive plan. We're on part 3 still. Part 3 is a little bit long of the plan of redemption because it's covering Genesis chapters 12 through 50. That's a pretty hefty amount of chapters, and so there's a lot of things to dissect. Last week, we left off in Acts 7. Oh, I'm not used to looking over there. I got to get used to that. In Acts 7, 2 through 4, talking about Stephen and how, God appeared to Abraham and before he lived in Haran. Go out from your land, and he went out, and after his father died, God removed him from the lands. And we talked about how we need to notice that God appeared to Abraham, not to his father, even though his father was still alive. And it's confirmed, we mentioned last week in Genesis 15:7, when the Lord, talking to Abraham, says, I am the Lord who brought you, Abram, out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. And there is the possibility, we don't know because it's not explicit, but it could be that in a city of idol worshippers, that Terah and Abram's other relatives, that they bowed down to the god of that temple. You remember that ziggurat, kind of square, and it's about 100 feet high, that one is. Does anybody remember what god that was dedicated to? Sin. Yeah, we all shy away from saying Nana, right? Or Nana.
It's not the way, was that the way they pronounced it, though?
Yeah, it's S-E-U-N, but the best that we can get is to the pronunciation is that it is pronounced as sin. And, there's the gate of judgment there that people would go through. Kind of interesting, again, for those who may not have been here, that you would go through the gate of judgment to bow down and worship sin. And so it's very possible that Abram's father, Terah, and relatives were idol worshippers. We don't exactly know because there's not a lot of information. But even though we don't know the details, Abraham doesn't leave his family as he was commanded by God to do so. But instead, he manages possibly to persuade his father to travel in the direction toward the land of Canaan. But Terah only gets so far because you have Ur of the Chaldeans, where they originally were, And then they traveled to Haran, which is on the way, in a roundabout way, to Canaan. And so it might have been, if Abram's relatives, his father, were idol worshippers, might have been easy to persuade them to go because of Haran also being filled with idol worshippers. And Terah could say, okay, well, God told you we need to go this direction. I don't mind going. I mean, after all, there's our people there and what have you. There's no real way to know fully. But Terah only gets so far, as both Ur and Haran, known to be the sinners of moon worships. It might have been considered too risky by Terah to continue on to Canaan. And the partial obedience of Abraham highlights the character of Abram. A man who has faith in the God of the Bible, but who's a bit reluctant to follow through on everything that God asks him to do. And in many ways, the story of Abraham mirrors the story of Israel as a nation. Yes, Israel as a nation is the people of God, set aside for a purpose, in particular for bringing the Messiah into the world, and yet Israel often fails miserably in being obedient to that very calling. You just look at the book of Judges, and you have a sinful people, a judge is sent, and there's punishment, the people repent, God forgives, then they go into sin again, and then there's a judge that's sent, and then there's punishment, and they ask for forgiveness, and God forgives. And it's just this whole cycle throughout the book of Judges. And we might ask, even, how much is this like us? In that we have faith in the God of the Bible, but we're reluctant, or often reluctant, to follow through on everything that God asks of us. And it may be as a congregation that there is something we don't follow through on. It may be something individually that we don't follow through on, right? So, oftentimes we will look at biblical figures and find a lot of flaws in them and say, but, how could you do this? But realistically, we can be guilty of the same thing, right? Any thoughts or comments? Okie dokie. So just to revisit these three great promises in verses 1 through 3 of Genesis 12, to give him a great land, to make him a great nation, and to make his name great. And if you don't remember, is that the third promise points directly to Christ there in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 16, that the promises were made to Abraham and to his offering. It does not say, and to offerings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring. And then there, Paul directly relates, well, who is that offspring? That offspring, he says, is Christ. There in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 16. Abraham, this imperfect man that James calls a friend of God, was called by God to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised, so that righteousness would be counted to them, us as well, and to make him the father of the circumcised, who are not merely circumcised, but who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. And so he's the father of all who believe, even those without being circumcised. Talking about Gentiles, he is the father of our faith as well. And it's the faith that he had even before, physical circumcision in the Old Testament, spiritual or the circumcision of the heart in the New Testament, before that appears. And it's in Genesis 12, 5 through 7, when we read that they came into the land of Canaan. You can see on the map up here, you've got Canaan up there to the north, and then you've got Jerusalem to the south, and the Egyptian domain around there. So, there's actually a fair amount of reading as we get into this. So if you want to turn to Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12, verse 10 tells us there's a great famine in the land. Here, Abram and his wife Sarai, they went into Egypt. And then beginning in verse 11, when he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, I know that you're a woman beautiful in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and they'll kill me. But they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life might be spared for your sake. And even though he lied, she wasn't his sister. Sarai was actually his half-sister. Even though he lied, God stepped in and afflicted Pharaoh with great plagues. Now, the Hebrew word there in verse 17, that's plagues, it can refer to sores or wounds. It doesn't require them to be deadly, like the death of the firstborn, for example, that would afflict Egypt. Sarai was kept safe, and it seems that Pharaoh eventually put two and two together and figured out that the timing and scope of his disease was somehow associated with Abraham's arrival, and that Sarah was his wife. And these plagues on Pharaoh, they weren't so much a punishment as a message, but they were definitely an example of the sin of one person causing others to suffer. Another important point for us, when we sin, we are often not the only ones that are affected by our sin. It could be a close family member. It could be a friend. It could be the church. Our sin rarely affects just us. In this case, it was Abram lying about his wife. And we might even say it was a small lie. I mean, half-sister, sister, they're close, right? We might even say it's a small lie. But at the same time, you might want to jot down Revelation 21 and verse 8 that all liars have their place in the lake of fire. But it still ended up as a message, a punishment of types, if you will, on Pharaoh. God's purpose in these plagues wasn't to unfairly punish Pharaoh and his court, but it was to really protect Sarai and force Abram to own up to the truth. Pharaoh hadn't done anything wrong, really. There's no law of Moses in effect. That doesn't come around until Exodus chapter 20. And so Pharaoh was going based off of the information that he was told. And he was told a half-truth. And so God, intervenes. And, Pharaoh has these plagues, but whatever they were, we don't know. And it's to protect Sarai, but at the same time, it's putting Abram in a position of needing to confess his sin. Right? And so Abram's actions, they serve as a poor testimony of God before this pagan king. But God would not allow his long-range plans, if you will, of sending the Savior through Abraham and Sarah's descendants to be foiled by, Abram's cowardice and Pharaoh's appetite for lust. Pharaoh got to see that Abraham's God was powerful. And that's a good lesson for any pagan, for any non-believer, to see that God is powerful. And Peter, he would speak to that in the New Testament, in always being ready to give a reason. Some translations say in defense, for the joy, for the hope that is in you. Pharaoh also saw that the God of Abraham didn't let him get away with the lie. You think about Pharaoh and all of these false gods, these idols, and people get away with everything. They can do whatever they want. Their gods aren't showing up for anything, right? But Abraham's God is, so Pharaoh is like, okay, I've taken this man's wife from him, but I'm prevented from doing anything with her. He has a God. His God is so powerful that his God not only protected her, but he afflicted me, and he caused Abram to confess. That's how God works. There's not just one singular line of motion with God. God is working in multiple lives, in multiple ways, at multiple times, right? God could be working in your life in more than just one way at the same time. All of this is happening at the same time, you know? He's protecting her, pricking Abram's heart, and afflicting Pharaoh all at the same time. So God can be working in your life on multiple things in your life all at the same time. Sometimes it might be like Pharaoh, to where it takes a little bit for us to recognize what's going on and putting two and two together, right?
Did Abraham learn his lesson though?
No.
He did it again.
Yeah, he did it again.
And then, was it Joseph or not?
And you know, that speaks to us too, is that, you know, we'll learn a lesson, but man, if we just don't go back and do it again. But again, God steps in there too, you know. Yes, ma'am.
I think our call is to stay close to the Lord and try to do His will. And sometimes I think it's a waste, maybe this is too simple, but we spend too much time trying to figure out why God did this, that, or the other. But like you're saying, there's so many things involved that we don't even see. God has
Sure.
And so as long as we keep our focus on trying to do God's will and stay close to Him, we are relieved of a lot of anxiety and stress and wasted energy.
No, absolutely. And, you know, Jesus speaks there in Matthew chapter 6, you know, he says, verse 33, seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all of these things will be added unto you. And then in verse 34, it's kind of like, look, tomorrow's got its own problems. You know, don't worry about tomorrow. James would say, I think it's chapter 4, verse 14, what is your life but a vapor? It's here one moment and gone the next. Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, starts off, you know, there in chapter 1, vanity of vanity, says the preacher. All is vanity. And so Colossians 3, 1 through 3, set your mind, set your sights on things above where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. So absolutely. And Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 13, you know, fear God, keep His commandments. This is the whole duty of man. Micah 6 and verse 8, the Lord has shown you what He requires of you. Seek justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. And so you're absolutely correct in that, yeah, if we just kind of focus on God, and then everything else, you know, we don't necessarily have to worry about it. Because no matter what happens, God is still on the throne. He has always been on the throne. No one is going to take His throne from Him. When we pass away, the world is going to keep spinning as long as God allows it to keep spinning. So there is some relief in that, absolutely. And unfortunately, it is a hard thing to get to that, to where how do I not worry about this? Because this is, this is what I'm dealing with right now, you know? Oh, go ahead.
Well, when we look at this history here of Abraham, it seems like that God was able to use Abraham's weaknesses, like his fear and his, lying, to accomplish God's ultimate goal,
Absolutely. I mean, you think of Noah, for example. Him and the other 7 members of his family, they're the ones that, get into the ark and make it through, and yet then what's Noah do? He gets drunk and everything, and he's sitting there laying naked in his tent. So yeah, absolutely, we are imperfect people. Jonah, who was told to go to Nineveh, and the first thing he does is, nope, I'm not running that way, I'm going to run this way. There's a weakness there. Paul prayed for relief, and God said, my strength is perfected in your weakness. So absolutely, God can use even the most broken people to accomplish what he wants. Absolutely. Any other thoughts or comments? Good thoughts.
Well, God's will is going to be accomplished with or without us.
Yeah.
So His will is going to follow through. He can use us, or He can push us aside and do it through someone else.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the benefits that we have is that we've got these 66 books making up, one great account, right? Abram didn't have that. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy, they hadn't been written yet. We have the benefit of being able to look back and read Israel's history, to read what the apostles were doing at the establishment of the church, to read as much as God, through the Spirit wants us to, the ministry of Christ and the miracles of Christ. They didn't have that. And so in knowing that, and I say that to both of your points, is that we can look and see all of God's will, as He's shown us through Scripture, being fulfilled. And that should give us even more hope. Because we don't have to walk through it blindly. We can sit here and turn and say, yeah, Noah, there's God's will. Abram, there's God's will. Esther, there's God's will. Haman, yep, he ended up on the gallows. That was God's will too. And we can look at all of this and not go through it blindly. So we really do have a blessing with Scripture. Thoughts? Any other thoughts or comments? Okay. And then, in looking at this, you might want to jot down Romans chapter 14 and verse 12. So each of us will give an account of himself to God. Because we've got Abram and his lie and what have you. And so, he had to give an account for that. And so at the end of the incident, Pharaoh sends him away with Sarai, along with the sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. By the way, Genesis 12 is also the first time that Egypt is mentioned as a nation. So I'm going to kind of speed along here a little bit. In Genesis 13, thank you, sir. Abram, Sarai, Lot, they're all in Negeb, which is in southern Israel. Both have a lot of money. They've got a lot of livestock, but the land couldn't support both of them. The herdsmen start fighting, arguing with each other. And then in Genesis 13, verses 8 through 12, then Abram said to Lot, let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now you might want to consider jotting down here Romans chapter 12 and verse 18. Romans 12 verse 18, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all men. You have Abram and you have Lot, both of them wealthy, both of them have a lot of animals and livestock, but the land can't support them both. And so Abram really was doing what Paul would speak to in his Roman letter. He's just trying to make peace. He's like, look, this is what's out here. You choose. You want to go this way? Fine, I'll go this way. You want to go this way? I'll go that way. That's okay, whatever you want. And Lot looks out and he sees what would be considered the better portion. The grass is always greener, right? People say the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. I'll tell you right now, the grass is always greener wherever you water the grass. Okay? Got nothing to do with the fence. And Abram knew that God had promised him that he was going to be blessed. And God strengthens that promise there in verses 14 through 18. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated him, and so he says, okay, you've done this, you've separated, Lot's gone. And then the Lord steps in. Maybe Abram's a little bit depressed. Maybe Abram is sitting there because he's an imperfect man saying, I knew that boy was just going to take the best thing. I'm an older man, and he's just leaving me out here. There ain't nothing here but rocks and Texas tumbleweeds in the middle of Jerusalem or something. Anyhow, but God steps in after Lot leaves, and he says, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward, for all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron. And there he built an altar to the Lord. So I could just imagine, sometimes that might be like us. We come at a crossroads and, we make a decision. It's like, okay, I'm going to do the Christian thing. I'm just going to maybe back down from an argument, or maybe I'm going to let this person have their way, whatever the case may be. And then, let's face it, in our humanity, we sit there and man, I wish they had made the other choice. I wish they had done this instead of what I'm doing and everything. And maybe that was like Abram a little bit. And God steps in and he says, lift up your eyes.
See, and I see it from the other point of view. Abram's faith was so strong, he didn't care which possession Lot took.
Yeah.
And God, in the following passages, is reaffirming his promise to Abraham to keep him encouraged in his faith.
No, absolutely. A fantastic possibility. Yeah, we read into it a lot. And part of the reason that, just for me, and this is just me personally, I wouldn't bind anybody to it at all. But part of the reason that I think that maybe he was a little bit, I don't want to say miffed, but maybe saddened or something, is because the Lord tells him to lift up his eyes. And so it's almost like maybe he was kind of downcast. Be like, you know what? There's a lot of dirt over here. A lot went where that water is. And, God says, look, lift up your eyes and see what I'm going to give you. I don't know. Just kind of one of those interesting things. Now, the tree on this particular slide, oops, I didn't go far enough, is actually called the Oak of Mamre. It's propped up there by these metal beams and planks. And by the Jewish people, then and even today, this is believed to be the tree that Abram pitched his tent near. And that this is the tree there. It's kind of gated off. There's a walkway around it. You can still go there and see it. But you've got all of these beams and what have you that have to prop it up because, well, if that is the particular tree, being 5,000-6,000 years old, it's going to be like most of us if we were that old, and it's going to be leaning over a little bit, what have you. Anyhow. So then we get into Genesis chapter 14. But before we do that, any questions, comments so far? Okay. So Genesis chapter 14, we've got war breaking out. Lot's taken hostage. See, the grass isn't always greener on the other side. You went where the land was nice and there was water. Next thing you know, war breaks out and you're taken hostage. How smart were you, little man? But Lot's taken hostage. Abram finds out about it, takes 318 men, rescues Lot, his kinsmen, the women, all the possessions, all of the slaves there, and upon his return, he's met by Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek, he's not only a king, but he is a priest of God Most High, which is talking about Abram's God. God, our God, the biblical God, little g God. Now, most scholars, I'll tell you, is that they believe Salem, mentioned in verse 18 there, is the ancient name for Jerusalem before it was conquered by King David, and who renamed it there in 2 Samuel chapter 5. And that's partially because of Psalm 76 in verse 2. Psalm 76 in verse 2, it says, "In Judah God is known, his name is great in Israel. His abode has been established in Salem, his dwelling place in Zion." And so that's part of the reason that they tend to believe that Salem is the ancient name for Jerusalem. So let's just real quick look at Genesis chapter 14, verses 18 through 20. "And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abraham by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything." So here we have Melchizedek, a Canaanite, because of the land that he's in, who somehow knows God. And he's familiar with him to such a degree that he is a priest of God. And here we should notice that one instance out of many where God's promise in Genesis chapter 12 is fulfilled. Genesis chapter 12, the beginning of verse 3. "I will bless those who bless you." Right? And by the way, this is also the text that many people refer to for giving a tenth of their income. You know, tithing in the church. Have you given your tithe? Being raised Southern Baptist, it was you tithe 10% of your income and what have you. A couple of things here is that one, Abram didn't give him a tenth of money. He gave him a tenth of everything. That's a tenth of livestock. That's a tenth of silver. That's a tenth of gold. It's a tenth of everything. And the other thing we have to recognize is that Abram, because it wasn't established yet, did not give it to the tabernacle, did not give it to a Levitical priest. He gave it to the king. You know, so we have people today who, you know, give a tenth of your income to the church. Well, if you're going based off of this text, you wouldn't give it to the church. You would give it to your pastor, and you would give a tenth of everything, not just your money. So, just kind of a side note there. But the Melchizedek priesthood is a type of the priesthood of Christ. And we next hear Melchizedek's name in Psalm 110, verse 4. Psalm 110, verse 4, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." And I'll give you some verses here, and then we'll end the class and pick it up next week. But that Psalm 110 verse 4 is also quoted in some form or fashion in Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 6, Hebrews 5:10, Hebrews 6:20, and I'll repeat these as well. Hebrews 7:1, Hebrews 7:10 and 11, Hebrews 7:15, and Hebrews 7:17. So again, that was Hebrews 5:6, 5:10, 6:20, 7:1, 7:10 and 11, 7:15, and 7:17. Anybody need me to repeat them again?
You're just talking about that verse 4 of Psalm
110,
being referred to in all those verses of Hebrews.
Yeah, in some form or fashion, sometimes it might be a full quote, sometimes it's just alluded to.
Just referring to Jesus as being,
Right. And so next week, when we pick up the class, we're going to connect Melchizedek here in Genesis, as well as Psalm 110, to Christ, and see how that works out in the order of redemption. So if you've ever kind of wondered about this, what is this order of Melchizedek and how does that fit in, then we're going to start off with that next week. But any closing thoughts or comments? Well, I appreciate your time, and thank you for the comments that you did make, and appreciate you.